This is Gemara in Yoma, Daf Gimel, and tonight's shir. Shvias chos for Shleimer from Many Vemego Shalben Chaim and Social Seven Reads the Service Ganandi Basim Chayso so Mindel the person Travelation as no sure if you should Khana Davinish Briva Shmo Ben Tila Dinam Khan Reason with Chayb Asmina Li Rachwa Tavamita Dinam Bashin Mendes and Khotavi Ben Avigav Fashion Sviben Figure the Rami Khal in Zona Sele Huva Menachem Mendel Ben Teva Besosha Khali Israel as well as Khoshidach for Atalea Basita and Menachem Mendel Ben Eli Sheva. We pick it up on the top of Gimel Amid Aleph, 4 lines down, and we're in the middle of a lengthy discussion, a discussion that began all the way back in Daf Beis Amid Aleph. All the way back, one daf ago, a discussion that began with regard to how do we know the din of Prisha, the din that the Kohen Gadol has to separate for 7 days in the Liskras Parhedrin, like we learned, for 7 days prior to the Avodah. So we had 2 different limudim, which are important as it'll set the table for what's about to come in a few moments. First, we said that there's a Mishnah that equates that Para Aduma is similar to Kohen Gadol, and therefore we learned that both of them have a din of separating for 7 days. Then we had a pasuk by the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, and that's really what we're in the middle of discussing. The pasuk said La Asois and Lechaper, and that's what taught us that both by the Yom Kippur, Lechaper, and La Asois, by the Para Aduma, there's a din similar to the Miluim that you have to separate for 7 days prior to working in the Beis Hamikdash prior to the Avodah. And yesterday we began this discussion going through all the different permutations and possibilities, what the Psukim could mean. Maybe the Psukim are referring to a regular Avodah, maybe the Psukim are referring to, and then we said this Xera Shava from Tziva, and that was yesterday. So we pick up from there, 4 lines down, says the Gemara, a similar question. Ve'ima atzeres, deprisha shiva liyem echadu. Maybe it's referring to, we said the Shalosh Regalim we tried to say. We said it can't be because the Miluyim was 1 day after 7 days, so it has to be a one-time event, and Shalosh Regalim is a 3-time event. So we said maybe it's one of the Shalosh Regalim, so we said that can't be either. Now we're trying, maybe it's Shavuos. Shavuos is 1 day, so maybe Shavuos is comparable to the Miluim, that is a 1 day after a 7-day preparation period. So Amar Rav Abba answers Rav Abba, Danin par echad vayel echad, mi par echad vayel echad. We equate that the karbanos are similar between Yom Kippur and the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, and the karbanos on Shavuos are different. So we learn out somewhere where we have 1 par and 1 ayil, which is on the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim and on the Yom Kippur. So too, the 8th day, I should say, the inauguration of the Beis Hamikdash. So too on Shavuos. On Yom Kippur. This comes to exclude that Shavuos has 2 elim. Shavuos has 2 different rams that need to be brought. So Shavuos is not the same thing as the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim. Asks the Gemara, but that's not true. That's a machlokes. According to the Man Amar that says Yom Kippur is 1 ayil. Now you're right, that Yom Kippur is equatable to the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim. But according to the Man Amar that says in Yom Kippur you have 2 elim, so now you're stuck. Now Yom Kippur is going to be the same thing as Shavuos. So why is it more mistaver, we're leaning more to learn that there's a din of 7-day preparation by Yom Kippur more than Shavuos? Now we quote the Brisa that discusses this machlokes, whether it's 1 or 2 days. The Tanya learned to the Brisa. Rabbi Yomer ayil echad hu amar kan hu amar bechomesh apikudim. This 1 ayil is the same ayil that's talked about in Vayikra. Rav Lezer bar Shimon omer shnei elim. Says Rav Lezer Shimon, no, there's 2 elim that are brought in Yom Kippur. Echad amar kan v'echad amar bechomesh apikudim. So says the Gemara, according to Rav Lezer bar Shimon, how do we know to learn out that Yom Kippur is equatable to the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, that is the separation of 7 days, our entire parak, our entire Mishnah? Maybe he's referring to Shavuos, 2 atzeres, which also has Shnei Elim, 2 rams. Answers the Gemara, Filu Tema of Rav Shimon. We could say we're even going within the opinion of Rav Shimon, who says that there are 2 rams. Hasam, why? Because Chad l'chayves hayoim, v'chad l'musafim. By Yom Kippur, it's true, Rav Shimon holds there are 2 elim, but they serve different purposes. Only one is the obligation of the day, similar to the one by the Miluim, and one is a carbon musaf. Whereas Shavuos, on Shavuos, both elim are more integral. Both of them are the actual obligation, so it's not as comparable to the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, where there's only 1 ram as a chayva. So that's why it can't be Shavuos. The Gemara continues. Ve'ima Rosh Hashanah. Maybe it's referring to Rosh Hashanah. Again, we're trying to figure out this din of 7 days of separation, which we learned is learning out to Avodah Yom Kippur, just learning out to Para Aduma from the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim. So we're going through all the other possibilities that maybe the Psukim are referring to. So maybe it's referring to Rosh Hashanah. That maybe the Kohen Gadol has to separate for 7 days prior to Rosh Hashanah. The Prishas Shiva Yom Echadu. And now it's going to be very similar to the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, that you're separating for 7 days before 1 day of Rosh Hashanah. Of course, Midaraisa, Rosh Hashanah is 1 day. Amar Avavua, Danin Par Va'ayil Shaloi, Mi Par Va'ayil Shaloi. We're learning out from the din of Yom Kippur and the din of Shivas Yimei HaMiluim. The Par and Ayil are unique, that they're Shaloi. They're from the Kohen Gadol's own pocket, his own money. La'afuke, Atzeres, and Rosh Hashanah. So we're seeing here that this answer of Avavua really goes back and is a second answer to what we saw a moment ago. A moment ago, we asked about Shavuos. We gave one answer, and now we're giving really a second answer, which is answering up Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah. Lafu Gatzeres, Rosh Hashanah, did Sibernenu. Who pays for those karbanos? It's true that maybe the karbanos are the same, but there's a difference. We want to know. We have basically a few moving pieces. We have Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, we have Yom Kippur, we have Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos. So which is more similar to Shivas Yimei HaMiluim to learn out the din of 7 days of separation? The Gemara is answering that Yom Kippur is similar. Why? Because the karbanos come from your own pocket, shalai of the kohen. Whereas at Seres, at Rosh Hashanah, they come from the communal funds, which reminds us of the Gemara's in Shkolim that we learned. Says the Gemara, but again, this is also debatable. Learned out from the Torah kach lecha mishalach, that you, the kohen, has to pay for it. Moving along to Gimel Amid Beis, va'asei lecha, and similarly it says, I'd say Lacha Mishalach. Elo, but that's not always everyone agrees. Elaman da Omar Mishal Tzibur, but there's a man da Omar that says that even by Yom Kippur, it comes from the Tzibur. Michael and Meimar, what are you going to answer? The Tanya. This is a brayso. Kach Lacha Mishalach, Vasei Lacha Mishalach, V'yechlue Lacha Mishal Tzibur. Divir Rav Yeshaya. We're going to have 4 opinions. Rav Yeshaya says there's a difference. By Kach Lacha and Asei Lacha, that means the Lacha from your own. Whereas when it comes to V'yechlue Lacha on the plural, that comes from the tzibur. Rav Yoina San Omer, and the Gemara is going to speak out exactly what the question is in a moment. Rav Yoina San Omer, Bein kach lecha, bein vayichu elecha mishal tzibur. Everything comes from the tzibur, nothing comes from the kohen himself. Umata malaymar kach lecha. So why does it say lecha singular? Kiviyachol, the Torah is teaching us a lesson. It's as if mishalach, and he writes a yoiser mishalahem, that Hashem is telling Moshe Rabbeinu that it's as if it's coming from your pocket more than it's coming from there. That's opinion number 2. But really, everything comes from the communal funds. Opinion number 3, Avachanan Omer Misham Rav Elazar, because of Echad Omer Vasiducha Aroinetz, because of Echad Omer Vasu Aronet Seishitim. HaKetzad. So what do we do with these 2 psukim? 2 different psukim. On one hand, it says Vasisa Lecha, singular. On the other hand, it says Va'asu, plural. So what's going on? Was the Aroin from a singular, from one person, or from a communal front? HaKetzad, says the Gemara, different time periods. Kam is Machisa Oisim Ritzoine Shel Makayim. That's going to differ whether it's considered. If you look at Rashi in the second narrow line points out Nikras Avodas al Shemam, that when we're following God's word, then it's al Shemam. Then it's as if Vasisa Lecha, it's coming from, then it's Vasu, then it's coming from everyone. But this is actually a debate how to learn this Rashi. But when we're not following God's will, Chas v'Shalom, then it's Vasisa Lecha, not referring to Klal Yisrael. But says the Gemara, okay, so we have a machlekes, Rav Yeshaya, we have Rav Yonasan, we have Abba Chanan. But now says the Gemara, Ad kan loy pligi. What is the machlekes? Ela bekichois dalma v'asiyois dalma. The machlekes is in a regular case, and we'll see what regular means in a moment. When it says kach lecha, it says asisa lecha. Kichois dalma. What does that refer to? Kach lecha samim. That refers to the ketayres. Asiyois dalma. What does that refer to? Asiyos lecha shtei chatzaitzros. The trumpets. Kasef. Avol hanoch peirushe kamefarish. But in these, everyone agrees. Both Rav Yonasan and Rav Yeshaya do not disagree, rather they agree and they hold that it comes from your own. And therefore says the Gemara, it's not a debate at all. We thought that there was a machlokes whether the money had to come from the kohen or had to come from the tzibur. Answers the Gemara, it's not true. Everyone is in agreement that it's mishal chahu, that it comes from your own pocket. Says the Gemara, Says the Gemara, b'miluim, when it comes to miluim mechti, let's see. Ksiv, what does the Torah say? Now, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of this whole story. Meaning, we sort of at this point have come to a bit of a conclusion. We've defended all the different issues. We just explained two different reasons why it can't be referring to Shavuos. We said one reason why it can't be referring to Rosh Hashanah. Now the Gemara goes into, and we go back to the original pasuk, and we darshan a little bit deeper exactly what was going on. And this was the reason why yesterday we pointed out that we should be precise and careful who was the person who brought down the original memra, the original din, the original statement, the pasuk, the makar of the Shiva Simei Miluim being the makar for the Shiva Simei Milu, for the din of Prisha separation of 7 days, learning out the two dinim we learned for the avoid of the Kayin and the Kayin God and the Yom Kippur. And number 2, the din of the Paraduma, we spoke out then, was Rav Yochanan. But now let's see the Gemara, as the Gemara is going to elaborate a bit further on this theme. Says the Gemara, what does it say by the Miluim? Klal Yisrael, you have to take the Sir Izin as a chatas by the Miluim. And the pasuk continues, Lamali. Why do we need the second pasuk? Shema mina kach lecha mishel chahu. So we said kach lecha, from your own, you Aaron HaKohen, you're the one that's going to pay for this carbon. By Yom Kippur, what does it say? It says, B'zois yavay Aaron el HaKodesh b'par ben bakar lechatos v'goymer. U'meis adas b'nei Yisrael yikach shnei seirei izim lechatos. V'hikrev es apar lechatos. One big pasuk, 2 psukim actually back to back. So Lamali, why do we need the second part? It says Vehikrev es apar chatos shma mina hayloi mishaloyu, that is coming from your own, and that's the reason why. This is actually, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit. This is the conclusion of the previous idea on the Gemara. That's the reason why we learn that the carbon of the Kohen Gadol comes from his own, and that's the reason why Yom Kippur is more comparable to the Shiva Simei Hami Luin. Ravash, that's one teretz. Again, I'm sorry. I got everyone a little bit confused. Let's speak this out again. The Gemara just concluded the previous part of the Gemara, that we were trying to figure out, how do we know that Yom Kippur is more comparable to Shiva Simei Miluim? Maybe Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos is more comparable. And the Gemara reason is because who is one paying for the karbanos? We're learning from the Psukim that by Yom Kippur and the Shiva Simei Miluim it's Mishaloi. It's from you, Aaron HaKohen. And that's the reason why Yom Kippur is going to be similar to the Shiva Simei Miluim, and there's going to be a din of Prisha by Yom Kippur. Rav Ashi gives a different teretz. Donin par lechatos va'aylo oila, mi par v'chatos va'aylo oila. Says Rav Ashi, again, this is the second teretz why we learn a Yom Kippur from the Shivas Mea Miluim and not Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos. Says Rav Ashi, you know why? Because we learn out the par chatos and aylo oila, the 2 karbanos in Yom Kippur, and by the inauguration of the Mishkan. We learned that out from par chatos aylo oila. La fuke, what does this exclude? Rosh Hashanah ve'atzeretz tervayu oiles nenu. A second reason, a very simple answer, says Rav Ashi. You're going convoluted, you're going long-winded trying to figure out. Kohen pays for it, community pays for it, which is similar. Says Rav Ashi, look at what the karbanos themselves are. Says Rav Ashi, their karbanos are on Yom Kippur the same as the Shiva Simei Miluim. It's a parla chatos and aylo oila. Whereas Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah, it's no sheiches. It's 2 oilos. A second teretz. A third teretz, says Ravina Amar. Let's keep it more global, says Ravina. Who performed the avoid on the Shiva Simei Miluim? Aaron HaKohen, the Kohen Gadol. So too, who performed the avoid in Yom Kippur? The Kohen Gadol. So that's why it's comparable. Whereas that comes to exclude all other questions. And now this teretz of Ravina goes all the way back to all the questions we asked yesterday. We asked yesterday about maybe it refers to all karbanos have a 7-day preparation period. Maybe it refers to the Shalosh Regalim. Maybe it refers to Rosh Hashanah. Maybe it refers to everything. Says Ravina, one big swooping answer going back on the entire almost blot and a half. Says Ravina, it's all a din in Kohen Gadol, whereas everything else wasn't a Kohen Gadol. And therefore says Ravina, you want to know what's equatable to the Shiva Simei Miluim? Simple. What is it? Yom Kippur, because that's done by the Kohen Gadol. Teretz number 1 of Ravina. This is the third teretz. We'll give a summary in a moment. Vigid Yamri, a second way of learning Ravina, Igedi Amri, Amar Ravina, Don Avoidis Techila, Me Avoidis Techila. We learned the Yom Kippur is the Techila, the first. We'll see what that means in a moment. And we learned that out for the Shiva Semei Amilum, which was the first. Lafu Kehani, that comes to exclude everything else. Talav Techila Nenu Shavuos, Rosh Hashanah, Shalosh Regalim. They're not the first Avoida. Says the Gemara, 1 second. My Techila, what do you mean by Techila? Elema, if you're going to tell me Techila by Kohen Gadol, if you can tell me what does Techila mean, it means it's done first by the Kohen Gadol. That's the first teretz. So what was the first teretz? The first teretz was that it's done by the Kohen Gadol. Ela avoida techila b'makim. Ela avoida techila b'makim. Me avoida techila b'makim. That it's the first avoida in that location. The Shiva Semei Amiluim was what? Was inauguration of the Mishkan. It's the first time they're working in the Beis Hamikdash on the 8th day when they're inaugurating the Beis Hamikdash. That's techila. That's the first. That's opening day. So too, Kodesh HaKodashim Yom Kippur, Kohen Gadol. That's opening day. It's the once a year. It's the only time that you're going to go into there. So therefore, that is more comparable. Whereas Rosh Hashanah, Shavuos, everything else is of course not the only time that occurs. And that is the conclusion. Now let's give a quick summary of the 3 different answers that we just had. We had Rav Ashi, we had Ravina, and we had the first teretz. The first teretz said the Gemara comes out, who pays for the carbon? Yom Kippur is similar to the Shiva Semei Amluim because the carbon comes from the Kohen's pocket. Aaron HaKohen, Kohen HaGadol, whereas everything else, Rosh Hashanah, Shavuos, comes from the communal funds, comes from the tzibur, and therefore you want to know which one is more comparable? Yom Kippur. Second teretz said Rav Ashi, you know what the reason is? The reason is the karbanos are the same. Par lechatos ayol oila, that is by Yom Kippur, that is by Shiva Semei Amiluim, whereas all other Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos, it's not true. They have 2 oilos, and therefore we do not learn that out to the 7-day preparation period. Comes Ravina, and Ravina comes along, and he says, let's go global. Who performs the Avaida? The Kohen Gadol. And therefore, that's only Yom Kippur and Shiva Semei Amiluim. And the Ikad Amri is global. It's the only time the Avaida is performed, once in a lifetime by the Shiva Semei Amiluim, and similarly once a year by Yom Kippur. And that is the conclusion of why we're learning out Yom Kippur from the Shiva Semei Amiluim, this din of the 7-day preparation period, which we began the entire Masechta with, that for 7 days we take the Kohen Gadol and we separate him the Lishkas Parahedrin. So no tama befalls him. Now says the Gemara, this was the Hakama I said 3 minutes ago. Now it will apply to over here. Let's see. Maybe we'll have to say it again so we don't get confusing. Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael and he said the name of Rav Yechon, Masni Chada. Learn out 1 din. Rav Yeshua ben Levi, Masni Tarti. He learned out 2 dinim. What does that mean? Rav Yochanan wrote 4 lines before the white lines. Masni Chada, Lasuyes Lechaper, Elu Maisi Yom Kippur. Says Rav Yochanan, what do we learn out from the Shiva Semei Amiluim? Lechaper. That by Yom Kippur, there's a 7-day preparation, waiting, separation period. Rav Yeshua ben Levi, Masni Tarti. 2 dinim, la'asois elu ma'isa para, lachaber elu ma'isa Yoma Kippurim. Says Rav Yeshua ben Levi, there is 2 dinim we learn out. Para Aduma and Yom Kippur. And this was what I was pointing out before, is that when we reminded ourselves that it's Rav Yochanan talking, everyone now is screaming, what do you mean Rav Yochanan Masni Chada? We remember yesterday's daf, or Rav Yochanan daf Beis Amud Aleph spoke out. The 2 dinim, like we just learned, the din of what? Para Aduma, and the din of Yom Kippur. So what's going on in the Gemara? Hold on, the Gemara is about to ask that question. Says the Gemara in the first white line, Rav Yochanan Masni Chada, is that true? So first the Gemara asks from the first part of the parak. V'anan tanan, how did this parak begin? We quoted a Mishnah. What was the Mishnah? That there's 7 days that we separate by Yom Kippur, and there's 7 days we separate by Para Aduma. So we see clearly that there's 2 times separation. How can you, Rav Yochanan, tell me there's only 1 time separation? That's not true. There's a separation by Para Aduma. Answers the Gemara, Maila Ba'alma. No, that din by Para Aduma is not necessarily a din. That's just a Maila. Which we saw over there. We saw in the Gemara that why did they make this Maila? Just to do a quick recap of what we saw yesterday. Was because there were special, we'll call it kulais in Para Aduma. Because a Para Aduma is kosher by a Tful Yom. A Tful Yom, someone who goes to the mikvah, did not have Erev Shemesh, the sun did not set. At some level, he is not 100% pure. Yet that kohen is allowed to do the Para Aduma. And furthermore, We saw yesterday that they purposely went out of their way to make the kohen tamei, make him go to the mikvah. The sun did not set. Then he burnt the parah aduma. Why? In order that to not believe and not to think like the tzedukim, that though you had to specifically wait for the sunset. So we go out of our way to make sure that there's no sunset, that you're tamei and there's no sunset. So because there was that special kula, we'll call it, the special din, that it's mutter by a full yaim, that's the reason Maila ba'alma. They made a special Maila. Maila number one we saw yesterday was that they used special kelim, kli avanim, kli galim, special utensils that did not become tamei. And Maila number two is that they separated him from 7 days before doing that avaida. But not necessarily is that a separate din that's a chiyuv like Rav Yochanan is learning over here. That is the first teretz. Says the Gemara, more fundamental, which is what bothering us. Yesterday, who was the memra? Who was the one that said over this whole din? It was Rav Yochanan that said, "Kasher tziva v'yom hazeh tziva Hashem la'asois lechaber aleichem la'asois ilamaisa par lechaber ilamaisa Yom Kippurim." This was all the din of Rav Yochanan. So what's going on? How could Rav Yochanan here say it's only a din by Yom Kippur, not by Bar Aduma? Answers the Gemara, Haho de Rabbi. That halach over there was Rav Yochanan, the name of his Rabbi, Rabbi Yishmael. How do we know that? Chas Rabbi Nam Rabbi Yochanan Misham Yishmael. La'asais ela ma'isa para l'chabelu ma'isa Yom Kippurim. And the Rishonim here point out the Gemara could have answered that maybe it's a machlokes what Rav Yochanan held. One is Rav Mechatzki in the name of Rav Yochanan, and one is Rav Dimi in the name of Rav Yochanan, but the Gemara preferred to say that it's Rav Yochanan in the name of his Rabbi because we see explicitly that Ravin said over in the name of Rav Yochanan, the name of Rav Yishmael, Rav Yochanan's Rabbi, this din that there's 2 dinim learned out from the pasuk, and that is the end of that discussion. So again, we have Rav Yochanan himself learns out only Yom Kippur, Rav Yeshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yishmael, the Rabbi of Yom Kippur, the Rabbi of Rav Yochanan learned out 2 dinim, learned out the din of Parah Aduma and the din of Yom Kippur. Just to wrap up today, says the Gemara, Amarli Reish Lakish to Rav Yochanan. We'll have one more discussion. Reish Lakish says to Rav Yochanan, where do you learn out the din of separating 7 days? Where do you learn out from? Miluim, from the Miluim. Ima Miluim kol hakasa behem ma'akev behem. 1 second. By the Miluim, the 7 days were integral. If you did not have 7 days, you couldn't have the inauguration of the Mishkan. Avachanami kol hakasa behem ma'akev behem. So too over here, is it true that if you don't have a 7-day separation period, you cannot do the avodah of the kohen gadol? And it may be. If you're going to answer me, says the Rish Lakish Rav Yochanan, yeah, it's true. You need to have a 7-day preparation period. It's not true. We said a good chazar of yesterday. We said we separate a second kohen gadol to be waiting in case the first kohen gadol becomes tamei. It says misaklin, we appoint him. It doesn't say he has to separate for 7 days. So clearly that second kohen, in the event he's necessary, does not have a 7-day preparation period. Clearly it's not integral. So maybe you can answer me. My misaktin mafrishin. Maybe what it meant by misaktin, it meant mafrishin that the second kohen gadol you separate him for 7 days. Can't be. Listen, misaktin, mafrishin. So the Mishnah should have kept it parallel. The Mishnah should have said mafrishin both or misaktin both. How could the Mishnah have said one misaktin, one mafrishin? What do we see? We see it's not integral. So Amar Lei, Rav Yochanan responds to Reish Lakish, Elamar Mechayov. He throws it back at him. Good Jew throws a question with a question. Throws it back to Rav Reish Lakish. So where do you learn it from? Yomar Yolafla. Amar, so he responded, Mi Sinai, from Moshe Rabbeinu, Dersif. Vayeshken Kvar Hashem Har Sinai Veichasei went on Shishes Yom. And the cloud covered over Har Sinai for 6 days. Vayikral Moshe B'Yom HaHu B'Yom HaShvi'i. They called out to Moshe on the 7th day. Says Rav Yochanan, says Rish Lakish, I should say. What does this teach me? A binyan av shekol anichlatz b'machne shchina ton prisha. This teaches us to everywhere else that if you're coming into machne shchina, if you're coming into Kodesh Kodashim, you need prisha. You have to separate. So it says Rav Lakish, this is where I know the din of prisha, not like you the Shivas Yimei Amiluim, because it's not the same. By the Shivas Yimei Amiluim, it had to be. It's integral. If you missed it, you couldn't inaugurate the Mishkan. But by the Kohen Gadol Navoid, that's not true. Says the Gemara, Tan Prisha Shisha, and we're going to sort of have a cliffhanger because this is going to take us all the way in Talmud Aleph. Ask the Gemara, Vanan Shiva Tanan. Our Mishnah 7, and you just told me 6. How does that work out? Answers the Gemara, Masnis and Reviewed Ben Besiri, the Chayish Latoma, the Reviewed Ben Besiri is a special din, he required 7. Maybe this din of Moshe Rabbeinu was 6. We'll do a quick hazar of this last price tomorrow, and we'll pick it up from here tomorrow.